Hello and welcome. This is Kristen Gicek. I'm the Vice President of Industry, Labor, and Economics here at the Center for Automotive Research. We're waiting for just a few more to join, but I thought I would give some introductory remarks. This is a joint webinar between our affiliates program, so our corporate members of the affiliates program that works with the Center for Automotive Research, as well as our Automotive Communities Partnership. That's a program they have that brings together automotive economic development and other key stakeholders in the auto industry across the United States. So both groups are blended here today, and we're really happy to have you all on board. Today's briefing is focused on NAFTA and a recent NAFTA analysis we published last week. As is always the case in trade negotiations, things have changed since then. So we are going to give you a brief update on where things stand. We will present, and then we will open up the floor for questions. So I will mute all lines, and then, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can use the chat feature and get a hold of us that way. But that way we won't hear anybody's, background noise, or if you're dialing into the car. So I'm about to mute everyone, and we'll get started. So our first part of the presentation will be from Bernard Swicky. Bernard is our Senior Automotive Analyst here at the Center for Automotive Research and directs the Automotive Communities Partnership. And he'll give us a little background on NAFTA and how we got to where we are.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our call today. I'm going to be starting us off before transitioning this to Kristen for the actual NAFTA negotiation content. And hopefully you have the presentation loaded there in front of you. Please message us if you have any issues with the presentation at all. And here we go. All right. So we're going to start with just a little bit of background about NAFTA and how we came to be where we are. And essentially, it's been since 1994 that we've been operating under NAFTA in the automotive industry here. Canada and Mexico are playing a huge role in the North American automotive industry. U.S. is very much reliant on both input and vehicle imports and exports, right? It's a complete region from those two countries. We'll show you a little bit of detail on that coming up. NAFTA, we believe, is a necessary ingredient to making this region more globally competitive, because partially that is an outcome of the affordable inputs that we get from Mexico, right? We sort of use the cliche term that everyone has their Mexico, Ours just happens to be the actual Mexico. But we believe that the lower cost of operating in Canada and the United States that's enabled by having Mexico there as a source of some of these inputs makes U.S. and Canadian-built vehicles competitive in terms of cost, quality, and the like with those that are built elsewhere around the world, be it Europe and Korea and the like. Okay. This slide makes the point that should we lose access to vehicles coming in from elsewhere, the U.S. is not self-sufficient. We cannot self-supply the vehicles that we consume here in the U.S., never mind then also exporting some portion of them. So our production is around 11 million units. We lose about 2.5 to exports. However, we import 8.7 million units for a total market of 17.3. So you can see there, we really do need 8.7 million vehicles to come from somewhere, be it within the NAFTA region or outside. And this next slide gives us a greater level of detail into where the vehicles in our market are coming from. First of all, 56% of the vehicles that are sold in the U.S. are built right here. And of that, about 31% from U.S. firms and the international firms who have U.S. manufacturing facilities at 25% of that. So within 5% actually of the domestics, a very, very high number and a great commitment from those international firms to build and sell in the U.S. The remaining 44% of U.S. sold vehicles come from elsewhere around the world. And what you'll see is that Mexico, Canada, and Japan have exactly the same share coming from each of those countries at 11%. And so Canada and Mexico, obviously, as a total, are 22% or nearly a quarter of the vehicles that are sold in the U.S. The next slide gives us a trade look for both Canada and Mexico, both in terms of the actual volume, but also the trend line going back to 2010. And essentially, with Canada, trade has been much more steady. Yes, we are running a deficit, but it's not nearly as substantial. And in fact, last year, it decreased. So a much more stable and kind of a balanced environment there. You can see the opposite on the right-hand side for U.S.-Mexican trade. We have an increase in trade. U.S. exports to Mexico have increased. However, that increase has been slight, and it's been vastly outpaced by the pace of imports coming in from Mexico. And you can see the deficit growing there as a result, and a large chunk of our NAFTA issues and the reasons that the administration is giving for the renegotiation stem from this very chart and its consequences. Wage-wise, this next slide I don't believe will surprise anyone. What we see is essentially parity between the U.S. and Canada in terms of motor vehicle and parts, labor costs. That's a wash where other factors can kind of decide what goes where. But the two countries have a huge disparity when it comes to Mexico, particularly when it comes to supplier and component labor. 341 in Mexico. There's a huge degree of variation within Mexico from region to region, so this is a national average. But regardless of regional variation, you can see the major disparity there between Mexico and the other two countries. This, of course, is a larger factor for some investments than others. Much of the really sophisticated work is highly automated, and that's where the Canadian and the U.S. manufacturing bases have an advantage. But the higher a share of the total cost of a component or good coming from labor will drive that to be biased towards location in Mexico. I should point out that that is nothing new. That is a global phenomenon, and we saw work going to Mexico based on this. For example, wiring harnesses, long before we had NAFTA. So you can't just hold NAFTA accountable for that. And in fact, Mexico is now losing some of this work, like wiring harnesses, to other lower cost competitors. NAFTA has been very good for U.S. consumers when it comes to buying cars. Here on this chart, we give you the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, of vehicles that you see there in purple, and the total, of vehicles there in green, and the total food and energy, the total market excluding food and energy for other goods, going all the way back to 1994 when NAFTA was enacted. And you can see barely an increase in the consumer cost of the vehicles compared to a huge increase in the cost of other components that consumers are buying. So NAFTA has certainly played a very positive role in making vehicles continue to be affordable for U.S. consumers. I'll finish on a few forecast slides. These are the latest from our economists here at CAR. The U.S. sales forecast, you can see, has a little bit of a plateau, going from a record of 17.5 million units in 2016 and bottoming out at 16.8 likely this year. So not really a dip, more of a plateau. The interesting thing happens when we start looking at that with production, which is on the next slide. And we'll give you the U.S. look followed by the North American look. And it's most valuable to juxtapose these two together. So you can see that production barely dips. We have a little bit of a dip. It's not that huge, but the key point is this. Production in the U.S. peaked at 12.1 million units in 2017, and even at the very end of this forecast going out to 2025, we don't make it all the way back. We come very, very close, but not all the way back. Something different happens when you look at the North American version of that production forecast. There you'll see likewise peak of 18.1 in 2016, so that's the same peak. However, by 2025, we're making more than an additional million units in North America total. And I can tell you that that is a result of Mexico. All of that growth is coming in from Mexico. So the U.S. and Canada are really missing out on opportunities for growth there. And 9 of the last 12 assembly plants announced in North America have gone to Mexico. So as we talk about steel tariffs, as we talk about renegotiating NAFTA, anything that makes U.S. manufacturing more expensive is going to be a huge factor in some of these decisions. Likewise, this also makes the point that we can fulfill peak demand with existing capacity, right? The fact that these forecasts don't call for a growing market is going to keep automakers from making huge U.S. Or Canadian investments if they're not needed, if they can be met with the current North American production base. And that'll come to light even more as Kristen talks about her content, and I'm going to turn the phone over to her right now.
Well, and that's, a very important point. Capacity is very expensive. Excess capacity is a huge risk. 2008 and 9 are not that far back in our rearview mirror. And so automakers will be loath to expend, and suppliers as well, expend a lot of money in creating new capacity in the U.S. if they can meet that peak demand with existing footprint. So I'm going to give an overview of where the U.S. proposal is as of Monday. So first of all, one of the aims of the U.S. proposal is to increase the regional value content. That's the amount of production and value of production that has to occur within the NAFTA region in order to qualify for zero tariffs when they cross the borders between our countries. 62.5 is already the highest of any U.S. free trade agreement with any other region or country. The U.S. is also looking to institute a regional value content share for steel and aluminum content, and they institute a new content measure, a labor value content requirement for share of work to be done at or above a specified wage. And I'll get into the details of each one of those. And first, we're going to look at the regional value content. So in the briefing that we published last Thursday, these were the content. This was the content of the RVC proposal. They include light and medium duty vehicles. It raises the RVC from 62.5 to 75% over 3 years. It covers 3 categories of parts. So there's core parts, essentially engines and transmissions, principal parts, and complementary parts. And those would each be at different levels of regional value content they would have to reach in order to trade freely within the region. As of Friday, we saw really no change in the light and medium duty vehicles. The grow-in moved from 3 years to 4 years for cars and 2 years for pickup trucks, a 4-year grow-in for all parts categories, and the ability for an importing country to extend that grow-in period for an additional 2 years if they see a company has demonstrated due diligence to comply. A new wrinkle is that EVs and AVs would have to meet a 75% RVC, and they're giving that category of vehicles a 9-year transition period, and this does include advanced battery production. The steel and aluminum content requires that at least 70% of North American sourced steel and aluminum be used in the production of core parts, engines and transmissions primarily. The update from last Friday is this is now linked to the total value of the automaker's steel and aluminum purchase and no longer just applicable to a supplier category. So it's based on the vehicle. Needs to be 70% of North American sourced steel and aluminum. The labor value content, as of last Thursday, required 30% of the vehicle content originating in a country where labor earns more than the median North American wage for production automotive manufacturing. And that's right around $15 or $16 an hour. There was a credit that you could meet up to 5% of that labor value content by counting certain R&D expenditures that are made in the NAFTA region. The updates from the most recent we've seen is that they've divided that labor value content and raised it a little. Light-duty vehicles up to 40% of the vehicle's value must be from regions paying at least $15, $16 an hour. Pickup trucks is even higher at 45%. And then the salaries for R&D, product development, sales, software, everything else can count up to 15 points. So that essentially lowers the LVC for cars to 25% and 30% for pickup trucks, if those are indeed engineered and researched and developed here in the NAFTA region. So those are the three main categories of the proposal. Our assessment of this proposal is that these content levels are very much too high, and that there are significant consequences that do not meet the aims that the United States has in these negotiations. We set out to do this using a very imperfect data set, and I'll admit that from the beginning. The Labeling Act, American Automotive Labeling Act, counts the percent parts content made in Canada and the United States. This is the only data that's available on a per vehicle basis that comes anywhere close to accounting for what percentage of the vehicle is imported and what percentage is from the United States and Canada. NAFTA data would be perfect to have, but that's not publicly available. And NAFTA does include assembly costs, manufacturing costs, and overhead. So the AALA is what you see on the sticker when you buy a car, and says this much of the parts comes from US and Canada. The engine was manufactured here, the transmission was manufactured here, and the vehicle was assembled here. So again, the big difference here is AALA is publicly available, NAFTA data are not. So to get down to how many vehicles might not qualify and how big of a deal is this for vehicles produced in the United States, we did some adjustments to the AALA data, going to our data sources we have for which engines and transmissions are fitted to which vehicles, and counting the content of that based on bigger trade data that we had to sort of normalize those values. So we did a lot to the AALA. We didn't use it straight up, but it's still a rather imperfect data set. Given that, I want to point out that not everything that's traded in the NAFTA region is using the NAFTA preference. And that is a really important point. Almost 99% of vehicle trade is traded using NAFTA preference, so that means they are meeting the 62.5% current regional value content. but motor vehicle bodies and trailers is much lower, and parts, interestingly enough, 16% of parts from Canada and 23% of parts from Mexico are currently, or last year, coming in to the United States without the NAFTA preference. Now, many of those are paying the most favored nation trading rate, and some are not tariffed at all. So there are also other programs that are listed here, so civil aircraft programs and things like that. So the NAFTA share of total leaves us with a big portion that are not able to meet the NAFTA preference for whatever reason. Most favored nation trading rates. This green lists all the WTO members. There's a few countries that are not members and some that are observers. But basically, the United States trades with all of the green countries in automotive parts and cars at a 2.5% rate. Pickup trucks and cargo vehicles are tariffed at 25%. And this, as you may know, goes back to a 1963 dispute we had with Europe over frozen chicken, and is therefore called the chicken tax. The chicken tax had a number of different tariffs in it. This is the only surviving piece of that trade battle that we had back in the early 60s before I was even born. And I think it's instructive, too. I mean, 25% is a very high tariff, and it has led automakers to do very interesting things to get around it. And, you know, we can follow up with that if any of you later if you'd like to know. But, you know, that high level has incentivized some automakers to locate their pickup and cargo vehicle production in the United States, and has incentivized others to import vehicles as a passenger vehicle and then convert it once it's here to being a cargo or a pickup. A whole host of different ways of getting around that tariff over the more than 50 years it's been in place. Another part that I think is pretty interesting is, on that country list, a lot of green countries also supply us automotive parts. So we look at Mexico and Canada and their share of trade in each one of the vehicle systems for which there is a separate trade code. And then we look at who are the next largest importers of those parts. So you see, in several cases, Japan imports more transmission and powertrain parts than Canada. China is importing more electrical and electronics than Canada. Japan, certainly more steering and suspension parts. And we have many other sources. For brake systems is equal to what we're getting from Mexico. Metal stampings, more from Canada. Next is Taiwan, and then Mexico. So there's many other places we can go. So if it becomes prohibitive to qualify for the NAFTA trading preference, and you're going to pay 2.5% on parts imports to the United States, you can pay 2.5% to Japan, from China, from the UK, from Taiwan, from South Korea, and many, many other countries, and Germany is on here as well, where we source parts. So if it's cheaper somewhere else and significantly cheaper to make up for that 2.5% tariff and any transport and logistics costs, we could lose work that is currently in Mexico to other even lower cost regions if it becomes too difficult to meet the high RVC and LVC that we have set in the proposal for NAFTA. I think another part of this is, when we first negotiated NAFTA back in 1994, Canada and Mexico certainly had automotive plants and parts suppliers there, but they've grown considerably. And not only have they grown considerably, but their free trade reach has grown considerably. So the United States, we can reach 28% of the global market for new vehicles without paying a tariff. And that, the blue share is the United States itself. Red is Mexico, or red is Canada, green is Mexico, and then that teal wedge is all of our other FTAs, so it's Korea, et cetera. So we reach 28% of the global market for new vehicles without tariff. Canada reaches 53% of the world market for new vehicles without tariff. The teal for them is any bilateral or multilateral agreements they're part of, and the orangey yellow is the augment beyond that they picked up with the recent agreement to the CPTPP. So they picked up a big share of additional countries and trade on a free trade basis through that agreement. Mexico, similarly, can reach 51% of the market for new vehicles without paying a tariff. And their wedge is a little smaller on CPTPP because they already had existing free trade agreements with many of the partners that are party to the CPTPP. So our results are that at least 22 and as many as 40 vehicle nameplates that currently qualify under NAFTA would not qualify under the U.S. proposal as that we evaluated as of last Thursday. So not the revisions that I've updated you on, but the last Thursday. So we estimate that the consequences of that are that between $2.1 and $3.8 billion would be added to the cost of light vehicles in the United States in order to comply with the provisions that and requirements the United States has set out in their proposal. That averages about $470 to $2,200 a vehicle to the cost of the particular vehicles that are affected. And assuming manufacturers pass through those increased costs, it could result in an estimated 60 to 150,000 lost U.S. light vehicle sales. There are some other considerations, however. We did not look into export impacts, including in the analysis. And of course, we would incur tariffs on U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico that also would not meet the NAFTA, new NAFTA requirements. It would make U.S. vehicle exports to the rest of the world less cost competitive because we're raising the cost to meet those new requirements. We were not able to include an analysis of medium-duty truck impacts. And finally, because there is no data on exactly which vehicle, from which steel and aluminum from which country goes in which vehicle, it's very difficult for us to evaluate the impact of the steel and aluminum RVC, and especially when it was on a parts basis. It might be a little easier now that it's back on vehicles. I want to point out that the timeline and the phase-in, 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, and many of you know this transition period is wholly inadequate. We find from our data that we collect through the Book of Deals, which is our proprietary database of all North American automaker investments going back almost 20 years now. We know, how many jobs, how many incentives, how big the investments were, but the minimum time to launch a new vehicle assembly capacity is 3 years once the decision has been made. And that doesn't count all of the resourcing and other things you need to do with the supply chain and supply chain capacity that might also need to be adjusted. And all of this, all of the U.S. proposal, all of this adjustment that you may need to do in this timeline might cost more than the 2.5% tariff. And if it costs more than 2.5% tariff, automakers and suppliers will pay the 2.5% tariff and source from wherever is the most advantageous to source. NAFTA as Bernard pointed out, makes North America a competitive and complete automotive region. We have low and high wage jobs that are distributed to optimal locations based on that cost, capability, and proximity to the key assets. This is really trying to redistribute the North American auto industry to benefit the United States at the cost of its neighbors, and the strategy is likely to result in these unintended consequences of even less U.S. content and less manufacturing in the U.S. So, if the higher RVC is non-binding, or that, the automakers and suppliers choose instead to pay the MFN tariff rate, sourcing could come from anywhere else, and sourcing that comes from outside North America is less likely to have U.S. content in that than it is if it was made in North America. So, we think that current rules of origin, the current proposal, and the updated proposal would weaken the competitiveness of the region as a whole, hurt our exports, and decrease future investment in the region. Now, there's a whole host of things we have to do before we even get to a new NAFTA. This is just a proposal. The other partners have not agreed to any of these conditions as of yet, and they come back to the table in just a little while. But I want to point out these other factors. So I'll give you a timeline of how our Trade Promotion Authority works in the United States. So this is being negotiated under Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. Typically, the Congress has the ability to negotiate treaties, but through this TPA, they grant that ability to the executive branch. They have specific requirements they have to meet, and they bring it back to Congress, and Congress can do an up-down vote. That's all they can do under Trade Promotion Authority. They cannot amend or change the agreement in any way, as long as the agreement is done adherent to the Trade Promotion Authority rules. Now, that becomes relevant because so far they have been following the TPA timeline and the TPA rules. And once we get the bill or the agreement signed, there's still a whole host of things that have to happen. So the agreement signed is right there, the first thing in green, and then we have to get through the rest of the green and the rest of the blue in order for this to become implemented as a new agreement. The negotiators come back to the table on May 7th for the continuing round of talks. They're taking a brief break while many U.S. trade officials are going to China to fix Chinese trade. By July 1st, the Congress has to reaffirm the TPA. So the TPA was authorized through 2021, and the President did ask for an extension for the negotiations in March, as he is required to do. But if Congress does not act, if Congress can act to disapprove the extension, so it's kind of a backwards thing here, but if they disapprove the extension of TPA, then when that agreement comes back to Congress, it can be amended, it can be torn apart, it can be a real hassle to get ratification in the U.S. Congress. I want to point out that June 7th is Canadian provincial elections. This is very important because Ontario, a province that makes up the majority of the auto industry and also a majority of the Canadian Parliament, is one of the provinces that is holding an election on June 7th. One of the elections that gets talked about a lot on the NAFTA negotiation timeline is the July 1st Mexican presidential election. And as of this morning, the far-left anti-American candidate, Mr. Obrador, is still a front-running candidate, and that could throw some real wrinkles into getting a new NAFTA agreement ratified should it be under his presidency. Now, he may be elected on July 1st, or the other candidate, we don't yet know, but they don't take office until much later in 2018. So there is a period of lame duck in the Mexican government where NAFTA could be approved in that period. And we don't know what happens once he takes office or the new president of Mexico. And then finally, the other timeline that people keep bringing up is the November midterm elections here in the United States. Usually midterm elections swing back to the party not in power, so we expect to see the Democrats have some pickup. And this issue is really politically interesting, as most Republican members of Congress are pro-free trade, and their president is bringing them back an agreement that restricts free trade significantly. And many Democrats that may be coming into office after the November 6th election are maybe more closely aligned with President Trump on NAFTA than they are on any other issue. And that's, pretty much an understatement that this is one area where they see eye to eye. There is, of course, political consequences from trade, and our trading partners know that. When you see, the retaliatory lists come up and they're going after Kentucky bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Florida orange juice, they know where the leaders of our Congress live and what's important to them in manufacturing in their states. But as far as imports, these are the states that are dependent upon imports from Mexico in motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts in 2017. And you see it's a vast majority of our country. And when you look at exports, where are we sending our vehicle output? We are sending most of our parts and vehicles to Canada, some to Mexico, some to Germany, South Korea, even Australia from Hawaii. And the trade from Hawaii is, of course, very small. But this does, the politics of trade will play a big role in the elections in Ontario, in Mexico, and in the United States. And if the agreement is not come too soon, it may get embroiled in the political debate a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to conclude our presentation, open up everyone's mic for comments and questions. Okay, your mics are all live. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions on what we should be looking at here at CAS.
This is Anne at the Canadian Consulate, Detroit. I think you've done a wonderful job. And So I haven't tried yet. Am I able to download this presentation, or do we have it in a downloadable form?
You will. You can have
Thank
it.
you.
It'll either be in the affiliate portal or in the ACP portal.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you are at the Indianapolis ACP meeting, you're probably going to see this presentation again.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still on, like, the way my schedule is now unfolding, I don't know that I'm going to actually be able to do that, so.
Got it.
Sadly.
Is there any other questions or comments?
I think you did a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of our other callers, we'd appreciate any feedback you've got, and we're happy to answer questions as well.
And of course, we can take it offline if you prefer not to do it on the big group call. So, you know, give a call to Bernard, or to, if you're an affiliate, to Brian or Katie, and they'll get you in touch with the researchers on these projects. Well, you're very quiet. So we really do appreciate you calling in for this brief update on where the NAFTA negotiations are. Thank you so much for your time and for your continued support of the Center for Automotive Research. Thank you.
Thank you.